Rain has a way of remembering things you'd rather forget. I was 16 the first time I understood that grief doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces and it never quite finishes arriving. My mother's hand was so thin by the end. I remember thinking that was strange because I'd always thought of her hands as strong. They'd scrubbed floors, sewn hems past midnight, carried grocery bags up 4 flights of stairs when the elevator broke and stayed broken for a year. Strong hands. But that night, in the hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye, her fingers around mine felt like paper. Miho. Her voice was barely a breath. Take care of your brother. Promise me. Her eyes, glassy with fever and something else, something final, found mine and held on like she was trying to press the words directly into my chest. Promise me he'll never be alone. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that about me from the start. I didn't cry, not then. Jisoo cried enough for both of us, 11 years old and sobbing into the blanket at the foot of the bed, too young to understand that the woman breathing her last breaths was asking his older brother to become something he hadn't chosen to be. I promise, I said. She smiled. That's the part one still sees sometimes in the space between sleep and waking. My mother's smile, relieved, like she'd just set down something impossibly heavy. She died 40 minutes later. Jisoo was 11 years old. And somewhere in that hospital room, quietly, without ceremony, my childhood packed its bags and left without saying goodbye. People talk about sacrifice like it's a single dramatic moment, a burning building, a speeding car, a hand reaching out. Nobody tells you that sacrifice is usually just Tuesday. It's waking up at 4 a.m. to stock shelves before school. It's telling your stomach to be quiet because there's only enough for one bowl of rice and it isn't yours tonight. It's watching your friends talk about university applications while you fill out a job application instead, and smiling like it doesn't cost you anything because Jisoo is standing right there and Jisoo cannot know what this costs. I worked at a convenience store in the mornings, a restaurant kitchen in the evenings. On weekends, I delivered anything that needed delivering: food, furniture, other people's dreams packaged in boxes I carried upstairs that never seemed to end. Jisoo went to the best schools. I made sure of that. Tutoring, textbooks, the uniform with the crest that meant something in this country, the kind of doors that crests could open. I never told him what any of it cost. I didn't want him carrying my exhaustion on top of his own grief. "Hyung, you look tired," he'd say sometimes, 16 now himself, looking at me with those eyes that were so much like our mother's. "I'm fine," I'd say. "Eat your food." He believed me. Or maybe he chose to. I've thought about that a lot since, whether Jisoo's belief in my fineness was innocence, or whether it was something closer to convenience. A question I didn't let myself ask for a long, long time. I was 26 when I stopped being invisible. It happened in a grocery store, if you can believe that, the most unglamorous setting for anything to happen at all. I was standing at a cafe near my apartment, actually, waiting for a coffee I'd told myself I deserved after a 14-hour shift, when a man in a coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent held the door for me and said, "After you." Small things. Should have meant nothing. But no one had held a door for me in 10 years. No one had looked at me, really looked, not glanced and dismissed, in longer than that. His name was Yoon. He came back to that cafe 3 more times that week. On the 4th, he sat down across from me without asking and said, "I'm going to be honest, this is embarrassing, but I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to you since Tuesday." I laughed. I actually laughed out loud for the first time in months. "That's a terrible line," I told him. "It's not a line. I don't have lines. I have," he gestured helplessly at himself, "this. Just this. Sincerity mostly. I want to tell you I was careful. I want to tell you that Miho, who had spent a decade building walls out of overtime shifts and unpaid bills, examined this man with a clear and skeptical eye before I let him in. I didn't. I let him in immediately, completely, because he was warm and he was kind and he chose me, and after 10 years of choosing everyone else, being chosen felt like finally being allowed to put down something I'd been carrying since I was 16 years old. I need to tell you about the first month because if I don't, you won't understand why I let everything happen the way it did later. You won't understand why I never once thought to ask the question I should have asked. Yoon was patient in a way I had never experienced from another person. Not patient like someone waiting for something, patient like someone who had already decided the waiting itself was worth doing. Our second date, he took me to a restaurant with white tablecloths and a menu with no prices on it, and when I went stiff with panic doing math in my head about a bill I couldn't pay, he must have seen it in my face, because he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "This is on me. All of it. Always when it's like this," he said. "I don't want you calculating anything tonight. Just eat. Just be here." "You don't know anything about me," I said. It came out sharper than I meant it to, old defenses, old reflexes. I know you order the cheapest thing on every menu and then insist you weren't that hungry anyway, he said, not unkindly. I know you check the clock like you're supposed to be somewhere else, every single time we meet, even when I know you have nowhere else to be. I know you flinch when people are generous with you, like generosity is a bill you'll have to pay back later with interest. He tilted his head. I'd like to know more. That's why I keep showing up. I didn't have an answer for that. I just looked at him, really looked the way no one had looked at me in years, and something in my chest that had been clenched shut since I was 16 loosened just slightly, just enough to let some air in. He met Jisoo for the first time 3 weeks later. I remember being nervous about it in a way that surprised me. Jisoo's opinion had always mattered more to me than my own comfort, an old habit from years of putting his needs first. But that meeting went fine. More than fine. Yoon was polite, asked Jisoo about his university courses, complimented him on getting into one of the top programs in the country. Jisoo was quieter than usual, I remember thinking, but I chalked it up to him being protective of me. My little brother, suspicious of the alpha who'd swept into his overworked Hyung's life. I didn't know then that quiet can mean many things. I didn't know that sometimes quiet is just shock wearing a very good disguise. 6 months passed like a held breath finally released. Yoon took me places I'd never been. The coast, a mountain temple at sunrise, a jazz bar downtown where he knew the owner, and we stayed until 2 a.m. laughing about nothing important. He learned how I took my coffee. He learned that I hated being surprised but loved being thought of, that there was a difference, and he never confused the two. He learned the story of my mother, of Jisoo, of the promise I'd made at 16, and when I finished telling him, late one night with my head on his chest and his heartbeat steady under my ear, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You've spent 10 years being in someone's shelter. Let me be yours for a while." I cried that night. Not from sadness. I think it was the first time in a decade I let myself cry from something other than exhaustion. The morning I found out I was pregnant, I sat on the bathroom floor of my small apartment for 20 minutes just holding the test, not quite able to make my body believe what my eyes were telling it. Omega pregnancies weren't rare, but they weren't something I'd let myself imagine for myself, not in the life I'd built out of overtime shifts and second-hand furniture. A family of my own had always felt like something reserved for other people, people whose lives hadn't been mortgaged out at 16 to keep a promise to a dying woman. When I told Yoon, I watched his face carefully, braced, old habits, for something to go wrong. For hesitation. For the polite, gentle retreat I'd seen from people before when things got real, when a relationship stopped being convenient and started being a commitment. Instead, his face broke open into something I'd never seen on him before. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to relief, like he'd been hoping for this without letting himself hope. "You're serious," he said. "I'm serious." He crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled me into him so tightly I laughed, half startled, half overwhelmed. "We're having a baby," he said into my hair, like he needed to hear himself say it to believe it. "Miho. We're having a baby." That night he knelt in my tiny kitchen, the one with the cabinet door that never closed right, and pulled a ring from his coat pocket like he'd been carrying it around for weeks waiting for the right moment. "Marry me," he said. "Let me build the family you never got to have. Let me be the person who never leaves." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I've had to sit with it so many times since. I said yes to a man who used the exact words, "never leaves." That would end up being the cruelest lie he ever told me, and he didn't even flinch saying them. Maybe he believed them when he said them. I've gone back and forth on that for a long time. I don't know if it makes it better or worse. The weeks after the proposal were, I think, the happiest of my entire life up to that point. We started looking at apartments, bigger ones with a second bedroom already half imagined as a nursery. Yoon came with me to my first prenatal appointment and gripped my hand so hard during the ultrasound that I had to remind him I still needed circulation in my fingers. When the doctor told us it was twins, he made a sound I'd never heard a grown man make before, something between a laugh and a sob, and pressed his forehead to mine right there in the exam room. "2 of you," he whispered. "The world is getting 2 of you. I don't think I've done anything to deserve that kind of luck." I believed him completely. That's the part that still aches, even now, even with everything I have since. I believed him with the whole, undefended part of myself that I had kept locked away since I was 16 years old, the part that hadn't trusted anyone with my happiness in a decade. I handed it to him freely. I had one more thing to do before the wedding, one thing that felt important in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I wanted Yoon to come to the house. Not a restaurant, not a hotel room, not neutral ground. I wanted him in the small apartment where Jisoo and I had built our whole fragile world after our mother died, sitting at the same table where I'd once split a single portion of rice into two smaller ones and told my little brother I wasn't hungry. I wanted my two families, the one I'd built out of sacrifice and the one I was building out of love, to sit in the same room together. I had no idea what I was about to walk both of them into. I spent 3 days cleaning an apartment that was already clean. It's strange, the things you do when you want someone to see your life and find it worthy. I scrubbed the same counter twice. I rearranged the photos on the shelf, the one of my mother, young and laughing, taken before either of her sons existed. The one of Jisoo at his middle school graduation, gap-toothed and proud. The one of the two of us, teenager and child, standing in front of our first apartment with cardboard boxes still taped shut behind us. You don't have to impress him, Jisoo said, watching me refold a blanket that didn't need refolding. He was 21 now, tall in a way that still sometimes surprised me, like I was seeing a stranger wearing my little brother's face. He's marrying you. Not the apartment. I know that, I said, though some old, tired part of me, the part that had spent a decade believing love had to be earned through neatness and usefulness, wasn't entirely convinced. Jisoo watched me for a moment longer than felt normal. I didn't clock it then. I clock it now, looking back, the way you notice a single wrong note only after you've heard the whole song and know how it ends. What's he like? Jisoo asked. Really like? Not the version you tell me about. Kind, I said. Patient. He listens like what I'm saying actually matters. I paused, smiling despite myself. He makes me feel like the last 10 years were worth something. Jisoo didn't say anything to that. He just nodded and turned back to setting the table, and I didn't think anything of the way his hands were very slightly unsteady around the chopsticks. Yoon arrived at 7, flowers in one hand and a bottle of wine too expensive for our small dining table in the other. He kissed my cheek in the doorway, murmured something about how nervous he was, how much he wanted Jisoo to like him, and I remember feeling so full, standing there. Full of a happiness I still wasn't fully used to carrying. Jisoo, I called toward the kitchen. Come meet. Jisoo came around the corner, drying his hands on a dish towel, a polite half-smile already arranged on his face for the fiancé he'd already technically met once before, months ago, briefly at a coffee shop. The half-smile didn't finish forming. I watched it happen in slow motion, the way you watch something break before you understand it's already broken. Jisoo's face went still, not surprised still, not nervous still, but a specific kind of still I'd never seen on him before, like every muscle in his body had simultaneously received the same silent order to stop. Yoon's hand, still holding the flowers out toward me, froze in the air. For a moment, 3 seconds, for I've counted them so many times since trying to understand what I missed, neither of them said a single word. The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the traffic outside, my own heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears for reasons I didn't understand yet. I said, my voice coming out strange, an uneasy laugh threaded through it because surely this was nothing, surely I was imagining the temperature of the room dropping. Have you two met before? The silence broke like a dropped glass. No, Yoon said. Too fast. His eyes hadn't left Jisoo's face. Never, Jisoo said at almost the exact same moment, and finally, his half-smile finished arranging itself, snapping into place like a mask clicking shut. I would remember. I want to tell you I noticed something wrong in the way they said it. I want to tell you some instinct flared, some old warning system built from years of having to read rooms for danger. But the truth is more embarrassing than that. The truth is I was so happy, so unused to happiness, so determined to protect this fragile new thing I'd built, that I chose, actively if unconsciously, to believe the easier story. Small world that you two haven't, I said laughing, setting the flowers in water. Sit. Dinner's almost ready. Neither of them looked at each other again for the rest of the meal. I remember being pleased by that at the time. I thought it meant they were being careful, respectful, keeping appropriate distance around each other out of consideration for me. I had it exactly backward. It wasn't far. It was two people holding their breath underwater, praying they wouldn't have to come up for air in front of me. Here is what I didn't know that night and what I would only learn, in agonizing, humiliating fragments, many months later. Yoon and Jisoo had met at university. Jisoo's second year, Yoon 3 years ahead of him, both of them young in a way that made everything feel enormous and permanent. They'd been together for a year and a half. Not a fling. Not a mistake made in a dorm room and forgotten by morning. A real thing with real tenderness in it, late nights studying together, a shared umbrella in the rain, the particular unguarded laughter of people who haven't yet been taught by life to protect themselves. They'd ended it when Yoon graduated and moved cities for work. Not because the love had run out. Jisoo told me this later, in one of the only moments he ever told me anything honest. But because neither of them had known, at 20 and 23, how to ask the love to survive the distance. It had ended softly. Sadly. The kind of ending that leaves a door unlocked even after everyone's walked away from the house. They had spent 5 years believing that the door was closed forever. And then I had, without knowing it, walked my fiancé directly back through it. After dinner, I did the dishes while Yoon and Jisoo sat in the living room, making the kind of small talk two strangers make. Jisoo's studies, Yoon's work, nothing of substance. I remember feeling so pleased, listening from the kitchen, at how normal it all sounded. How safe. I dried my hands and came to sit beside Yoon on the couch, and he put his arm around me automatically, easily, the way he always did, and I remember thinking, this is what I promised my mother I'd build. Not for Jisoo. For myself too, finally. I didn't see Jisoo's eyes flick to where Yoon's hand rested on my shoulder. I didn't see the specific, complicated grief that crossed his face and vanished just as fast. I was happy. I was so happy that I was blind, and I think, I've had a long time to think about this, that my happiness wasn't just something that happened to me that night. It was something I chose, actively, the way you choose not to look directly at the sun even when some part of you suspects it might be a fire about to burn your whole house down. Yoon left around 11. He kissed me goodnight at the door, soft and lingering, his hand cradling the side of my face like I was something precious he couldn't quite believe he got to keep. Your brother's protective of you, he murmured against my lips. That's good. That means he loves you. He's all I have left, I said. Besides you now. Something flickered across Yoon's face then, quick, gone before I could name it. I told myself it was tenderness. I told myself a lot of things that year that I no longer believe. He kissed me once more, deeper this time, and I melted into it the way I always did, safe in the certainty that this warmth, this mouth against mine, this hand at the small of my back, was the one thing in my life that would never be taken from me. I closed the door behind him and turned to find Jisoo already in his room, door shut, light off. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think anything of a great many things that year, and I would spend a long time afterward learning exactly how much that not thinking had cost me. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who are lying to you. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like loneliness at first. It feels like static, a faint hum underneath an otherwise ordinary life so quiet you convince yourself you imagined it. Looking back, I can trace the static to that dinner. But at the time, all I noticed was that the months between the engagement and the wedding were busy in a way that felt normal, even good. Venues to see. A registry Yoon insisted on despite my protests that we didn't need gifts. We had everything we needed. Doctor's appointments as my belly grew round enough that strangers started smiling at me on the street, the way they do at pregnant people, like you've become public property in the nicest possible way. I was 28 weeks along when I first noticed Yoon's phone buzzing differently. I don't mean that in some dramatic, suspicious partner way, I want to be honest about how gradual it was. It started as him stepping into another room to take calls he used to take in front of me. Then it was him silencing the phone entirely during dinner, something he'd never done before, followed by a tightness around his eyes for the rest of the evening that he'd blame on work stress. Everything all right? I asked one night, watching him slide his phone face down onto the counter for the third time that week. Fine. Just a difficult client. He smiled at me, the same smile, warm as ever, and I let it disarm me the way it always did. Come here. Let me feel them kick. He pressed his palm flat against my stomach, and when one of the twins obliged with a firm little thump against his hand, his whole face lit up with an unguarded joy that made it impossible to hold on to suspicion. How could a man capable of that expression be lying to me? I know now that joy and betrayal aren't mutually exclusive. I didn't know it then. I was 28, pregnant, engaged to a man I loved, and I desperately wanted to believe that the hardest chapter of my life was finally behind me. Jisoo started coming around less. At first I chalked it up to school. His course load had gotten heavier, he was in his final year, there were exams and papers and the particular exhaustion of a young person trying to finish something important. When he did visit, he was warmer than usual, almost overcompensating, bringing me foods I was craving, sitting with me for hours asking about the babies, what names I was considering, whether I wanted to know the genders. You don't have to do all this, I told him once, touched, running my hand over his hair the way I used to when he was small and I was the only parent he had left. I know you're busy. I want to, he said, and there was something in his voice, something raw and apologetic that I mistook completely for love. I want to be here for you. As much as I can. I didn't ask him what he meant by as much as I could. I didn't ask him why. Sometimes he'd go quiet mid-sentence, staring at nothing before shaking himself back into the conversation. I didn't ask why. Twice I caught him checking his phone with an expression I couldn't place, something between longing and dread, before quickly pocketing it when he noticed me watching. I had spent so many years being the one who asked no questions, who absorbed hardship without complaint, that I had never quite learned how to ask hard questions of the people I loved. I had built my entire identity around giving, around sacrifice, around not being a burden, and that identity, I realize now, made me an extraordinarily easy person to deceive. I didn't push. I didn't pry. I trusted, completely, because trust was the one luxury I had always denied myself, and I was drunk on finally being allowed to have it. What I didn't see, what I would only piece together much later, from Jisu's own broken confession and from things Yoon let slip in the ugly weeks after everything fell apart, was this. They had started meeting 3 weeks after that dinner. It began, Jisu told me once, as nothing. An accidental run-in at a cafe near the university. A stilted conversation. An apology from Yoon for how strange he must have seemed at dinner. I was just surprised seeing you again after so long. I hope it wasn't obvious. And Jisu, 21 and still half in love with a door he'd thought was closed, saying it was fine, it was nothing. He was happy for Yoon and Miho, truly. It should have ended there. It should have been one conversation, one closure, one final goodbye to something that belonged in the past. But 5 years of silence has a way of making old feelings seem larger than they are, more urgent, more like unfinished business than like something that had already once ended for good reasons. They met again the following week. And the week after that. Coffee turned into dinner, turned into long walks where they talked about everything except the one thing that mattered, that Yoon was engaged, that the fiancé was pregnant, that the fiancé was Jisu's own brother, the person who had given up his entire life to raise him. I told myself it was innocent, Jisu would say to me later, his voice breaking. Every single time I told myself it was innocent. And every single time I knew I was lying. You never told me any of this himself. Not really. Not with any honesty. What I got from him in the end were fragments, self-serving and incomplete, offered only when there was no other option left but confession. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That comes later. For now, in this part of the story, I was still the fiancé glowing with pregnancy, still planning a wedding, still utterly unaware that 2 of the people I loved most in the world were slowly, carefully, building a betrayal I wouldn't see coming until it was standing directly in front of me. There is one memory from that period I return to often, turning it over like a stone, looking for the crack I should have seen. It was a Sunday. Yoon had told me he had a work event he couldn't skip. Jisu had told me he was studying at a friend's apartment for finals. I spent the afternoon alone, assembling a crib we'd bought for the nursery, following instructions with the particular stubborn patience of someone who has never in his life had the luxury of asking for help. My phone buzzed. A photo from Yoon, himself in a suit at what looked like a corporate dinner, caption missing you, wish you were here instead of stuck listening to these people talk about quarterly earnings. I smiled and set the crib panel aside to reply, something soft and teasing, and as I did I noticed, just for a second easy to dismiss, a shadow at the edge of the photo. A hand resting on the back of a chair beside him, wearing a ring I recognized. A university ring. The kind Jisu wore, a gift from our mother before she died, one of the only things of hers he still had. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I told myself I was being ridiculous, that half the graduates of that university had that same ring, that pregnancy hormones were making me paranoid, that the alternative explanation was so much more painful than the mundane one, that of course I should choose the mundane one. I put my phone down. I went back to the crib. I did not ask a single question. I think about that hand in the photo more than almost anything else from that year. Not because it was proof, it wasn't, not really, not on its own. But because it was the first thread and I had it in my hands, I chose with my whole undefended heart to let it go. The wedding was set for a Saturday in early spring, 6 weeks before my due date. I remember being grateful for the timing. I'd be far enough along that the twins would be safe if anything happened early, but not so enormous that I couldn't stand for the ceremony without wanting to sit down halfway through my own vows. I had a dress altered twice to accommodate my growing belly. I remember standing in front of the mirror at the final fitting, running my hands over the fabric stretched across the place where my children were living, and feeling something so unfamiliar it took me a moment to name it. Pride. Not gratitude, not relief, pride. For the first time in my adult life, I looked at myself and saw someone who had earned a good thing, rather than someone who had simply been lucky enough to receive one. I wish I could tell you I held on to that feeling. I didn't get to keep it for very long. 3 weeks before the wedding, Yoon started coming home late. Not dramatically late. Not the kind of late that invites a scene. Just, later. An hour, sometimes two, always with an explanation ready before I even asked. A meeting ran long, a client needed hand-holding and traffic from the other side of the city. He'd kiss my forehead, apologize for missing dinner, ask about my day with what seemed like genuine interest, and I'd tell him and he'd listen and everything would seem, on the surface, exactly as it had always been. But I had spent a decade of my life reading the fine print of exhaustion on other people's faces. My mother's, my own, the faces of co-workers pulling double shifts to make rent. I knew what tiredness from overwork looked like. This wasn't that. This was a different kind of tired. The tired of someone holding two separate lives very carefully apart, terrified of the moment they might touch. I didn't have a name for what I was seeing yet. I only had the feeling, persistent, low, unwelcome, that something in my house had shifted its weight in the night, and I couldn't yet see what. Jisoo came to see me the week before the wedding, ostensibly to help me finish addressing invitations, though we both knew that was mostly done. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and I noticed, really noticed for the first time in weeks, how thin he'd gotten. How his eyes had a hollowed, sleepless quality that didn't match a healthy 21-year-old finishing his final semester. "Are you eating enough?" I asked, old habits surfacing instantly, the caretaker in me never fully retired even now that I had someone else to lean on. "I'm fine, Hyung." He said it too fast. The same too fast I'd heard from Yoon once at a dinner table, a lifetime ago, though I hadn't yet connected the two moments in my memory. "You don't look fine." I reached across and took his hand, a small, thin hand that I still, somewhere in me, remembered as an 11-year-old's hand, gripping mine at our mother's bedside. "Jisoo, talk to me. Whatever it is." For one terrible, suspended second, something moved behind his eyes. I watched him war with himself. Watched, though I didn't understand what I was watching at the time, the exact moment a confession rose up in his throat and then, deliberately, was swallowed back down. "Just finals," he said finally, pulling his hand back gently. "I'm stressed about finals. That's all it is." I believed him. Of course I believed him. He was my brother. I had raised him. I had built my entire understanding of the world around the idea that I would always know when Jisoo was hurting, because protecting him from hurt had been the organizing principle of my life since I was 16 years old. I did not yet understand that the person hurting him, this time, was standing close enough to me that I kissed him goodnight every evening. 4 days before the wedding, I went to surprise Yoon at his office. I don't know exactly what made me do it. Some restlessness, some late pregnancy energy that needed somewhere to go, some small persistent itch under my skin that I still didn't have words for. I brought lunch, the kind of soft, sentimental gesture I'd never had the luxury of making for anyone before Yoon, and I took the elevator up to his floor feeling almost giddy with it. His assistant told me he'd stepped out for a personal call and would be back in 20 minutes. I said I'd wait and I sat in the small reception area outside his office, lunch bag balanced on my knees, and I heard his voice, low, urgent, coming from the stairwell around the corner where he must have thought no one would hear him. "Can't keep doing this, you know that, right? Every time we say it's the last time and then..." Pause. I couldn't hear the other voice, whoever he was speaking to, murmuring back too quietly to carry. I know I promised him. I promised both of you things I don't think I know how to keep anymore." Another pause longer. Then, so quiet I almost missed it, almost convinced myself later I'd imagined it. "I still love you. That hasn't changed. I don't know what to do with that." I sat very still in that reception area, lunch bag balanced on my knees, feeling something in my chest go cold and slow, like ice forming over water that had, until 30 seconds ago, been perfectly warm. I did not go around the corner. I did not confront him. I told myself, in that moment, and I am ashamed of this now though I understand why I did it, that I had misheard. That pregnancy and exhaustion were making me imagine things. That a decade of being left by people was making me look for exits even in a life where, this time, surely no exit existed. I left lunch with his assistant and went home. I did not cry that night either. I want you to notice that pattern because it matters later. I had spent so many years not crying, not at my mother's deathbed, not through a decade of exhausting sacrifice, not once during my entire relationship with Yoon, even when small warning signs accumulated like snow I refused to acknowledge was burying me, that by the time the truth finally fully arrived, I almost didn't remember how. The wedding was 2 days away when I finally asked Yoon directly. We were in bed, the lights off, my back against his chest the way we always slept, his hand resting protectively over the curve where our children lived. I lay there for a long time, working up the courage before I finally said it into the dark. "Is there someone else?" His hand went still against my stomach. "What?" Miho, no, why would you? You've been distant. Late nights. Calls you take in other rooms. I kept my voice even, though my heart was slamming against my ribs hard enough that I was sure he could feel it through my back. I heard you on the phone at your office last week. You said you still loved someone. You said you'd made a promise you didn't know how to keep. The silence that followed was the longest of my entire life. That was work, he said finally. Too fast. The same too fast I'd now heard from both of them, though I still hadn't let myself connect the pattern. A difficult negotiation. I say strange things when I'm stressed, you know that. I wanted so badly to believe him. I want you to understand the specific, desperate shape of that wanting. I was 34 weeks pregnant, 2 days from a wedding I'd spent months planning, in love with a man for the first time in my entire adult life, and the alternative to believing him was a grief so large I didn't know if I'd survive walking into it. So I chose to believe him. One more time. The last time, though I didn't know that yet. Okay, I whispered. He pulled me closer, kissed the back of my neck, whispered that he loved me, that he loved our children, that in 2 days I would be his husband and nothing in the world could make him happier. I fell asleep in his arms that night, still not knowing that the wedding I'd spent months planning would never happen, that the truth, when it finally arrived, would arrive not through a confession, not through a slow unraveling, but all at once, in a single moment, in a way that would leave no room left for doubt or hope, or the merciful lie I had been telling myself for months. I found out the day before the wedding, and I found out because of a mirror. I want to tell you about that mirror first because it matters. It hung in the small fitting room at the back of the bridal shop where I'd gone for my final dress adjustment. The seamstress had insisted, saying the fabric had shifted with how much I'd grown in the last 2 weeks, and wanted one last look before the big day. I remember standing there in front of that mirror in my half-altered dress, turning slowly, watching the fabric settle over the curve of my belly, and thinking, absurdly, that I looked like someone in a photograph. Someone else's happy life. My phone buzzed on the bench beside me. A message from Yoon. Running late from the office. Meet you at home tonight, I love you. Ordinary. Unremarkable. I would have thought nothing of it, except that 30 seconds later, still holding my phone, an old habit surfaced. A habit from years of managing a shared calendar with my mother's medical appointments, then later Jisu's school schedule, then later still Yoon's, because I was the one who remembered things. I was always the one who remembered things, and I opened our shared location app, the one Yoon had set up himself in the early weeks of our relationship, half joking, half serious. So, you always know I'm exactly where I say I am. No secrets. He was not at the office. The little blue dot that represented him sat steady over an apartment building I didn't recognize, 20 minutes from his headquarters, in a part of the city we had no reason to be in. I stood there in my wedding dress in front of that mirror, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. I want to be honest about what happened next because I've thought about it so many times since, turned it over from every angle, and I still don't fully understand my own calm. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not call him, demanding an explanation the way I imagine most people would have. I changed out of the dress. I thanked the seamstress. I got in a taxi. I gave the driver the address on my phone, and I sat in the back seat with my hands folded over my belly, feeling the twins shift and turn inside me, and I thought, clearly, calmly, in a voice that sounded almost like my mother's, whatever is behind that door, you will still be standing when you walk out of it. You have survived worse than this. You will survive this too. I don't know if that thought was strength or if it was simply the numbness of a person whose body has decided, correctly, that this is not the moment to feel anything at full volume. The apartment building was unremarkable. A mid-range complex, the kind young professionals rent while saving for something better. I found the buzzer for the unit matching the address, and my finger hovered over it for a long moment before I lowered my hand instead and simply pushed the building's outer door, which some careless resident had left propped with a folded newspaper. I climbed 3 flights of stairs. I have never known, before or since, whether I climbed them slowly because my body genuinely couldn't move any faster, or because some last desperate part of me was trying to give the truth time to change itself before I arrived. It did not change itself. I stood outside apartment 3B for what felt like a very long time. I could hear voices inside, low and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind had even finished processing why. One voice was Yoon's. The other was Jisu's. I didn't knock. I don't know why I didn't knock. Some instinct, some final mercy toward myself, made me try the handle instead, and it gave beneath my hand, unlocked, and I pushed the door open into a small living room where my fiancé and my brother sat close together on a couch, Yoon's hand resting on the back of Jisu's neck in a gesture so tender, so practiced, so clearly familiar that I understood everything in the half-second before either of them noticed I was standing there. They looked up at the same moment. I have never before or since seen two human faces change so fast. Nobody spoke for a long time. I remember the specific quality of that silence. Thick, suffocating, the three of us frozen in a triangle of shock and guilt and the wreckage of a truth that had finally stopped hiding. Miho. Yoon stood first, his hand still half raised from where it had been resting on my brother's neck, as if he could somehow unhappen the last 5 seconds by force of will. This isn't I can explain? Don't. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Steadier than I felt. Don't you dare tell me this isn't what it looks like. I can see exactly what it looks like. Jisoo hadn't moved. He sat frozen on the couch, staring up at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Not defiance, not yet, but something closer to a child caught in the act of something he'd known the whole time was wrong. How long? I said. I wasn't looking at Yoon anymore. I was looking at my brother, the boy I had raised, the boy I had starved myself quietly for so he could eat, the boy whose education I had funded with a decade of my own stolen future. How long, Jisoo? He didn't answer. How long? My voice cracked, finally, on the second time asking, the calm I'd been holding onto since the bridal shop began to fracture. I'm asking you a question. How long? Since a few weeks after the dinner, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Since we ran into each other. You told me you'd never met him before that night. I know. You lied to my face. Both of you lied to my face in my own home, at a table I set for the man I was going to marry. I felt something rising in my throat, something enormous and shapeless that I didn't yet have a name for, because I hadn't let myself feel this kind of thing in so long that I'd almost forgotten what it was. Do you understand what I did for you? Do you understand what you cost me? I never went to university. I never had a 20s that looked like anyone else's. I worked until my hands split open so that you could sit in classrooms with people whose families had never had to choose between electricity and food. I did that. Gladly. Because I promised our mother. I know what you did. Jisoo was on his feet now, and there were tears in his eyes, but I could not, in that moment, find a single part of myself that softened toward them. I've known my entire life that you gave up. Do you think I don't carry that? Do you think it doesn't crush me every single day, knowing you burned your whole life down so I could have mine? Then why, I said, and my voice broke fully now, why would you do this to me? Of everything you could have taken, why would you take this? Jisoo's face changed then. The guilt didn't vanish, but something harder moved in underneath it. Something that had clearly been building for weeks, maybe longer, a justification he'd rehearsed to himself in the dark so many times it had started to sound, to him, like truth. Yoon was mine first, he said. The room went very quiet. He was mine before he was ever yours, Jisoo said again, and his voice was steadier now, terribly steady, the voice of someone who has decided that honesty, however cruel, is easier than the alternative. We loved each other for 1.5 years at university. It ended because life got in the way, not because it was over. And when I saw him again sitting in our kitchen engaged to you, his jaw tightened. I told myself I'd let it go. I tried. I promise you I tried. But it didn't go anywhere, Hyung. It was still there the whole time, underneath everything, and you decided that meant you were entitled to him. My voice had gone somewhere strange and flat, past anger into something colder. Even though he was engaged to me. Even though I am carrying his children. Even though I am your brother, and I raised you, and I gave up every single thing I had so that you could have a life worth living. He'll always be mine, Jisoo said, and there was no apology left in his voice at all now. Just a raw, exposed certainty that landed in my chest like a physical blow. I won't leave him. I'm sorry for how you found out. I'm not sorry that it happened. I stood there in that small apartment doorway, 7 months pregnant with twins fathered by a man who was, at that exact moment, standing 3 feet from the brother he'd been secretly loving for months, and I felt something inside me that had been holding steady for 16 years, since a hospital room, since a dying woman's trembling hand, since a promise I had never once broken. Simply and quietly give way. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg either of them to explain themselves further, though there were 1,000 questions still sitting unasked in my throat. I simply nodded. Then keep him, I said. The both of you deserve each other. I turned around and walked back down the 3 flights of stairs I had climbed 20 minutes earlier as an engaged man with a wedding the next day, and I walked out of that building as someone entirely different. Someone who understood, with total and merciless clarity, exactly how alone he actually was. Yoon did not follow me. Not down the stairs. Not out onto the street. Not that night, not the next morning, not on the day the wedding was supposed to happen and instead did not. I want you to sit with that the way I've had to sit with it so many times since. In the moment that mattered most, the moment where a single act of chasing after me, of choosing me even imperfectly, even too late, might have meant something, he simply let me go. I have never decided whether that was the cruelest thing he did to me, or, in some strange way, the last honest one. I canceled the wedding myself. I called the venue at 6 in the morning before I'd even slept, my voice flat and businesslike in a way that must have unsettled the poor man on the other end of the line. I canceled the caterer. I canceled the flowers. I sent back the dress, still smelling faintly of the seamstress's shop, without ever telling her why the man who'd been so proud in that mirror the day before wasn't coming back to pick it up. I moved out of the apartment I'd started sharing with Yoon within the week. It wasn't difficult, logistically. I hadn't brought much with me when I moved in. A decade of poverty teaches you not to accumulate things you might have to leave behind quickly, but emotionally, packing those boxes alone, 7 months pregnant, was one of the hardest things I have ever done, and I have done a great many hard things. I found a smaller place. Cheaper, further from the city center, up 2 flights of stairs that made my ankles swell by the time I reached the top. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that winter that I no longer fully remember believing. Yoon called 17 times in the first month. I know the number exactly because I counted, obsessively, the way you count something when counting is easier than feeling. I didn't answer any of them. He sent messages, apologies at first, long and rambling, full of words like confused and never meant to and I still want to be a father to them, and then, when I didn't respond to those, something colder and more practical. Questions about the pregnancy, about doctor's appointments, about what I intended to do regarding his legal rights to the children. I answered exactly one of those messages, the one about legal rights, because I had learned by then, the hard way, the way I'd learned everything, that some things could not simply be ignored into non-existence. You'll know when they're born. Beyond that, I have nothing else to say to you. He didn't try again after that, not for a long while. I don't know if that was respect or relief. I've stopped trying to guess at his intentions. Cost me too much once guessing wrong. Jisoo moved into Yoon's apartment 3 weeks after that day in the doorway. I know this only because a mutual acquaintance mentioned it to me in passing, not realizing, or perhaps realizing exactly, what those words would do to me. I didn't reach out to confirm it. I didn't need to. Something in me had already accepted it as true, the way you accept the weather without needing to be told twice that it's raining when you can already feel yourself getting wet. I want to tell you I felt nothing when I heard it. That would be a lie, and I promised myself telling this story that I would not lie to you the way I was lied to. What I felt was a specific, complicated grief, not for the relationship with Yoon, which I understood by then to be over entirely and without appeal, but for Jisoo. For the 11-year-old boy who had cried at our mother's bedside. For the promise I had made her, which I had somehow, despite everything, still not entirely let go of even now. I grieved my brother while he was still alive. I think that might be one of the loneliest kinds of grief there is. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and given everything I'd already survived by that point, that is not a small thing to say. I was 7, then 8 months pregnant with twins, alone, working as much as my body would allow, which was less and less as the weeks went on. I picked up freelance administrative work I could do from home. Invoicing, scheduling, the unglamorous back-office labor that companies were happy to outsource cheaply to someone who couldn't easily leave the house. It wasn't enough most months. I sold things I didn't need. I learned, once again, the particular exhausting mathematics of stretching too little money across too many needs, a skill I'd hoped I'd left behind for good. I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because I want you to understand exactly how far down I had fallen when a stranger, on an ordinary rainy afternoon, held a door open for a moment longer than politeness required and in doing so, quietly began to change the entire shape of my life. It happened at the grocery store 3 blocks from my new apartment, on a Tuesday, in the kind of steady gray rain that makes everything feel a little more difficult than it should be. I was 36 weeks pregnant, exhausted, standing at the register with a small basket of groceries, the cheap, practical kind, the kind you buy when you're counting every bill in your wallet before you even reach the counter. And when the cashier told me the total, I reached for my wallet and discovered, with a wave of humiliation so sharp it nearly brought tears to my eyes, that I'd left it at home. "I'm so sorry," I said, already starting to gather the bags to set them aside, my face hot, painfully aware of the small line forming behind me. "I'll have to come back. I'll cover it." The voice came from just behind me. I turned to find a man, tall, maybe mid-30s, in a plain dark coat that didn't announce itself the way Yoon's expensive tailoring always had, already holding his card out to the cashier, waving off my protest before I could even fully form it. "You really don't have to." I know I don't have to. He smiled, and there was something in it that felt entirely unlike anything I'd experienced from Yoon in all our months together. Not performance, not charm deployed with intention, just simple, unhurried kindness. I'd like to. Please let me. I let him, mostly because I was too tired and too embarrassed to keep arguing in front of a line of increasingly impatient strangers. When the transaction was done, he helped me gather my bags, without being asked, without making it a production, and walked with me toward the door. My name is Jaewon, he said, holding the door for me the way he had, apparently, been the kind of person to do all along. If you ever need anything, really, call me. He pressed a small card into my hand, nothing more than a name and a phone number, no company logo, no title. I mean that. I thanked him, more out of politeness than any real intention, and went home in the rain with my groceries and the strange, unfamiliar warmth of a small kindness I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. I called him that evening. Only to thank him properly, I told myself. Only because it felt rude not to. We talked for 2 hours. I won't pretend the friendship that followed was some instant, dramatic thing. It wasn't. It grew slowly the way real things do. A phone call here, a coffee there, always careful, always respectful of the enormous, obvious fact that I was heavily pregnant with another man's children and clearly, visibly, still carrying wounds I hadn't finished healing. What I noticed over those weeks was what Jaewon didn't do. He didn't pity me. He didn't ask probing questions about what had happened, though I could tell he'd pieced together enough to understand the shape of it. He didn't treat my pregnancy as a complication to be managed around, the way I half expected any interested party to. He asked about my work, my opinions, the small, specific texture of my days, and he listened to the answers like they mattered, like I mattered, independent of anything I could offer him. You admire people who survive things, I said to him once, only half joking, during one of our long evening phone calls. Is that a personality trait or a professional hazard? He laughed, a real laugh, warm and a little surprised, like I'd caught him off guard in a way he enjoyed. Maybe both. I've spent a lot of my life around people who inherited everything and worked for none of it. You built your entire life out of nothing but stubbornness and love for your brother. I find that, he paused like he was choosing the word carefully, extraordinary. Not tragic. Extraordinary. No one had ever called my life extraordinary before. People had called it hard, set, unfair. Never extraordinary, like it was something to be admired rather than pitied. I started, slowly, carefully, to let him in. I told him everything, eventually, Yoon Jisoo, the doorway, the wedding that never happened. I braced myself, telling it, for the reaction I'd learned to expect from people. The awkward pause, the careful retreat, the polite distance that follows when someone realizes exactly how complicated your life actually is. Jaewon didn't retreat. I don't care whose babies they are, he said when I finally, hesitantly, brought up the pregnancy directly, worried it would be the thing that finally scared him off the way it seemed to scare off everyone else. I only care that they're yours. And if you'll let me, he hesitated, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed genuinely unsure of himself. I'd like to love all 3 of you. However that ends up looking. Whatever pace you need. I cried on the phone that night, the first time I'd properly cried since the doorway, since the wedding that never happened, since the whole slow collapse of the life I'd thought I was finally allowed to have. Not from sadness this time. From something else. Something that felt terrifyingly, dangerously like hope. It was only weeks later, almost by accident, through a passing comment from a mutual acquaintance, that I learned Jaewon wasn't simply a kind stranger with a comfortable coat and a steady job. He was the CEO of a company whose name I recognized instantly, one of the largest in the country, the kind of name that opened doors simply by being spoken aloud. When I confronted him about it, half embarrassed, half annoyed that he hadn't told me himself, he just shrugged, unbothered. Would it have changed anything if I'd told you on day one? Would you have believed I was helping you in that grocery store because I meant it, and not because I was performing generosity for some reason? He shook his head. I didn't want you to see the company. I wanted you to see me. I understood then, something I hadn't fully understood before, that the difference between Yoon and Jaewon was not charm or money or attentiveness. It was honesty. Yoon had shown me a version of himself designed to be loved. Jaewon simply let me see all of him, unpolished parts included, and trusted that would be enough. It was. He proposed 3 weeks before I gave birth. It wasn't dramatic. No restaurant, no orchestrated surprise, no ring hidden in dessert. We were sitting on the small balcony of my apartment, the one with the wobbly railing I kept meaning to ask the landlord to fix, watching the sun go down over a city that had taken almost everything from me and was slowly giving something back. I know this is fast, Jaewon said, turning the small box over in his hands like he wasn't quite sure how to begin. I know you have every reason in the world not to trust promises like this one. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm not going to be another person who breaks one. I looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, steady man who had held a door open for a stranger and never once, in all the months since, treated that kindness as a debt I owed him. Ask me properly, I said, my voice unsteady, and I'll give you my answer. He knelt right there on the wobbly balcony and asked. I said yes before he'd even fully finished the sentence, the same as I once had with Yoon, except this time, saying yes didn't feel like relief at finally being chosen. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known. Until that exact moment, I'd been searching for my entire life. We married quietly 2 weeks before my due date, in a small ceremony with people who actually knew and loved me rather than a guest list built for appearances. Jaewon introduced me at the small reception afterward not as someone he was rescuing, not as a cautionary tale with a happy ending bolted on, but simply, proudly, as his husband. I'd like you all to know, he said, raising his glass, his eyes finding mine across the room, that I am the luckiest man here tonight. Not because of anything I've built. Because of who agreed to build the rest of it with me. Within months of the wedding, he'd brought me into the company, not as a favor, not as a token, but because he'd seen, over the course of our long conversations, exactly how sharp and capable I was, sharpened by a decade of managing impossible situations with almost no resources. I became his second in command, trusted with decisions that mattered, respected by executives twice my age who had, at first, assumed I was nothing more than the boss's pretty young spouse. For the first time in my life, someone stood beside me instead of behind me, or worse, instead of walking away. 2 months after the wedding, Yoon walked into Jaewon's headquarters for a job interview. I wasn't supposed to be in that meeting. I'd stopped by my husband's office on my way to my own, twins asleep at home with the nanny, a folder of documents in my hand that could easily have waited until later. I was sitting beside Jaewon's desk, laughing at something he'd said, when the door opened and the interviewer's assistant led in the candidate for the afternoon's final interview. Yoon's face when he saw me went the color of old paper. I watched from a strange, calm distance as every version of the story he must have told himself over the past several months, that I was struggling somewhere, that I needed him, that he could still, someday, make amends and be welcomed back into some corner of my life, collapsed in the space of a single glance. I was not struggling. I was sitting confidently beside the country's most respected CEO, wearing a ring that had been given without conditions in an office where I was known and valued for exactly who I was. He didn't say a word. He closed the door so quietly I almost didn't hear it, and by the time Jaewon's assistant checked the hallway, he was already gone from the building, having withdrawn his application without explanation. I felt many things at that moment. Vindication briefly. Something closer to pity, longer lasting. But mostly, I felt nothing at all where I'd expected to feel a great deal. A wound I'd been protecting for months finally, quietly closed over. Jisoo came to my door not long after that. I hadn't heard from him in the months since the doorway. No calls, no messages, nothing but the silence of two people who no longer knew how to be siblings. When I opened the door and found him standing there, thinner than I remembered, his relationship with Yoon clearly having collapsed under whatever weight it could never quite carry, I felt my chest tighten with an old, familiar ache. Brother. His voice broke on the word. Please. I have nowhere else to go. I looked at him for a long moment, this person I had raised, fed, sacrificed a decade of my own life for, who had once been the entire reason I got up every single exhausting morning of my early 20s. I looked for the 11-year-old boy crying at our mother's bedside, and some small aching part of me still found him, still loved him, still would have given almost anything once to protect him from a single moment of pain. But I had learned something in the past year that I hadn't understood before, that love, even the deepest, most sacrificial kind, does not obligate you to accept every version of the person you love, especially not the version that chose, with clear eyes and full knowledge, to destroy the one thing that had ever been entirely mine. The brother I loved, I said quietly, disappeared the day he chose to betray me. I've already grieved him. You are not him anymore, and this is not your home. I closed the door gently and I did not open it again. I won't tell you it didn't hurt. It did, more than almost anything else in this whole story. But some doors close not out of cruelty, but out of the same fierce self-protection I had spent my entire life extending to everyone except myself. I was finally, for the first time, extending it to me. The twins were born on a warm evening in early summer. A boy first, then for minutes later, a girl, both of them healthy, both of them loud in a way that made the delivery room staff laugh even through their exhaustion. Jaiwan held them each in turn, tears streaming freely down his face, utterly unashamed of them, pressing kiss after kiss to my forehead between murmured, disbelieving thank yous. Our family, he whispered, cradling our daughter against his chest while our son slept against mine, is finally complete. Months later, on a quiet evening after the twins had finally, mercifully fallen asleep, I stepped out onto the balcony of the home Jaiwan and I now shared. A real home, one with a nursery that had been built with love rather than borrowed hope, overlooking a skyline glittering gold and silver beneath a clear night sky. Jaiwan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin lightly against my shoulder the way he always did, like he still, after everything, couldn't quite believe he got to. You spent your whole life protecting everyone else, he murmured against my ear. Your mother's memory. Your brother. Even you, in your own way for longer than you should have. Let me protect you now. Let that be my whole job if you'll let it. I turned in his arms to face him and found his eyes shining in the low golden light, so full of a steady, unhurried devotion that it still, even now, sometimes took my breath away. I never believed happiness could belong to someone like me, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was something you had to earn through suffering, and that I would just keep suffering forever and call it love. Jaiwan reached up and gently lifted my chin, his thumb brushing softly against my cheek. It always belonged to you, he said. You just spent so long giving it away to people who didn't deserve it that you forgot how to keep some for yourself. He leaned in, slow and unhurried, and kissed me, not the desperate, grateful kisses of early love, not the performance of a man trying to prove something, but the deep, settled kiss of someone who intended to keep choosing me quietly and completely for every single day still ahead of us. I melted into it the way I always did with him, my hands finding the front of his shirt, holding on not out of fear this time, but out of a joy so complete it felt like the only appropriate response. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, our fingers intertwined between us, the soft sound of our sleeping children's breathing drifting faintly from the open window behind us. For the first time in my entire life, I understood what home actually felt like. Not revenge against the people who had hurt me. Not the wealth or status Jaiwan had brought into my life, though I wasn't foolish enough to pretend those things hadn't made survival easier. Not even, in the end, simply being chosen the way I had once mistaken Yoon's attention for love. It was this, being loved completely, without condition, without performance by someone who woke up every single day and chose me again, not because I had sacrificed enough to earn it, not because I had suffered enough to deserve it, but simply because I was, at last, exactly the person he wanted to spend his life with. And this time, beneath that glowing, endless sky, with my husband's heartbeat steady beneath my palm and our children sleeping safely just behind us, I finally let myself believe it completely. I would never be abandoned again.